While the military is a mixing pot of different personality types, it should be no surprise that many of the men who serve are the rough and rugged types, the kind of guys who would rather spend their weekends out in the woods than doing anything else. One of the reasons people in the military seem to bump into, shall we say, odd things is because they are often deployed to places where civilized people don't tend to go, but even places back home in the U.S. are just as remote, the Appalachian Mountains. For instance, I once saw a map of all the locations where people have gone missing in the United States, and overlaid on top of that map was another kind of map, a map of all the cave systems in the U.S. Both pieces of information seem to coincide: the location of the cave systems and missing persons. Maybe some people just got hurt and couldn't get themselves back out, or maybe the map clearly implies it was something that hurt them. What you're about to hear are two stories from two veterans, one a Marine who served in Iraq, the other who served during the 1980s and was possibly a soldier, although his branch of service was not stated. Both of these men grew up in the woods, and both of these men, after encountering something terrifying, say that they don't enjoy the woods like they used to. These are true stories of two veterans who believe that they were maliciously stalked and hunted by something massive that could mimic the sounds of other animals. Since Bluetooth audio became a thing, I couldn't wait to ditch the wires, and now, after years of testing a ton of wireless earbuds, even the premium brands, I finally had a chance to try these Raycon everyday earbuds, and man, I really do wish I tried them sooner. I always listen to audio before sleeping, and I hate how painful earbuds can be to wear, but not Raycons. I could wear these all day, and speaking of wearing them all the time, I cannot tell you how helpful the awareness mode is. Finally, there's an earbud that allows me to hear what's going on around me. The case itself is another bonus. It's durable, works with wireless charging, and holds up to 32 hours of battery life. These are just as good as premium brands, and at half the price. Raycons are an absolute steal, especially right now. It's time to save big for Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Go to Byron.com wartime today and get up to 30% off site-wide. That's right, you'll get up to 30% off everything on Raycon's website when you go to Byron.com wartime. And after hearing our next stories, you will truly appreciate having that awareness mode even more. Oh wait, it's the oldest trick in the book, try to make us think they're injured cubs. All right, how we moving in just like always? All right, you go that way, I'm going to go this way. Hey, up before we break off. Yeah, what's up? Something I feel off about this. Do you? Yeah, you feel that way too. I just thought maybe it's because we haven't been out here in a while. Well, maybe they changed their tactics. I don't know. Well, we've come this far. Let's just go. This first story was posted online by a U.S. Marine with the handle that one guy Brian. We will therefore assume that we can call him Brian. After setting out into the woods one evening looking to hunt down a pack of coyotes, Brian, alongside another fellow Marine, suddenly realized that the coyote sounds they had been following weren't being made by coyotes. He writes, my story begins after my first tour in Iraq. I view myself as a very tough person, but it isn't hard to find someone tougher than me. I grew up in an area where the high desert begins to turn into the forest. This is as close as you can get to being in the woods without actually being in the woods. Lots of trees, but very little running or standing water. I spent much of my youth exploring this area, so much so most people would see it as walking into their living room, as one can expect. There were two things that I wanted to do when I got home on leave: drink some booze with old friends and go back into those woods. There was always something new to find, like where Native Americans had chiseled out some of their arrows, just random things like that. Well, one night on leave, my best friend and I went out to hunt down some coyotes that had been terrorizing local ranches, something he and I were well known for. I forgot to mention my best friend was also a Marine. I called him Boot at the time, because he just got out of boot camp. We'd already determined where this pack liked to hunt at night. Coyotes are nocturnal and like to make lots of yipping noises, so they are easier to hunt at night. I won't get into too many details for hunting coyotes for protection reasons, so we are getting close to their den, and we can tell because they start the old trick any predator makes: the whole pretend I'm a cub or injured rabbit stick. We start our typical closing in tactic. However, while we are doing so, we're having a convo that is something along the lines of this is different. I make the assumption that it's because we haven't been out here in a while and that they may have changed some of their tactics since our last hunt. So we continue on. Nothing changes as we get closer, and as we get to within about 25 yards of the coyote den, we both realize that this is clearly not what it seems. So we make a decision to go communication silent, move back out of the grove of trees this den is, and wait for movement. I can't remember the amount of time that passed, but it was under an The memory is a bit foggy, but the first thing I remember is my friend calling me by my last name, something I was used to being in the military, but it was weird coming from someone I grew up with. A couple of minutes later, we saw movement. We called it out to each other. It emerged from the trees. What I saw was a man, but he was as tall as the trees, which were about 7 to 10 feet in height. I'm terrified at this point, and I don't know if it was PTSD or just plain old fear, but I aimed in and shot it. I waited for it to take a few steps and fall down, but it didn't. It just kept walking. My friend fires, and the same thing happens at this point. We go into battle mode and keep firing, intent on killing it. Our thought was that it was trying to lure us because it knew how we hunted and tried to use it against us. It just stops and turns perpendicular to our positions and walks off. Now, I was using a .308 and my friend was using a .306. This thing should have dropped after the first 5 rounds, but it didn't. We considered chasing it, but then realized that whatever it takes to kill it, we just didn't have it. We did a tactical retreat for about a quarter mile, then just booked it home. We found the actual coyote den a week later, about 10 miles on the opposite side of the town that we lived in. Whatever this thing was, it had clearly been hunting us for a very long time to lead us that far in the wrong direction and had planned accordingly, because it even knew how to leave feces and urine from different members of a coyote pack. My friend and I still hunt if needed, but we always talk about that one time we were the hunted. Hey, over here, you young whippersnapper, you come all the way through that holler. Yes, ma'am. Is that all right? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trespass or nothing. Boy, don't you ever go through there ever. There was a reason they went and blocked that road. Oh, why is that, ma'am? Well, it's best you come up on the porch and sit for a spell. Boy, I'm going to tell you the story now. Whether you believe me or not ain't my business, but you ask around, other people can tell you. Come on, then you're too young for lightning, but I'll get you some lemonade. While massive bipedal hominids roaming the forests of North America are often considered to be curious, gentle animals, Brian's story isn't the only one that exposes the creature's more predatory nature. This next story, set against the backdrop of Tennessee's Walden Ridge Trail, gives further insight into the uncanny mimicking abilities of these elusive cryptids. The author, an unidentified veteran who we'll refer to as Mark, recalls a harrowing encounter he had with a creature known locally as the Whistling Jack. He writes, "This is a true story. I have never told this story to anyone before now for reasons that will be obvious after you hear it. This story takes place over several time periods. I am 53 years old. I grew up in a small community on the southern end of Walden's Ridge in eastern Tennessee. Walden's Ridge is a flat plateau that spans most of Tennessee from south to north on the east side of the Sequatchie Valley. Growing up, I lived in a small community. There are only a little over 200 people. We just called it the mountain. The community was surrounded on all sides by forest bordering the Apprentice Cooper Game Reserve. As a kid, we would ride our bikes all over the trails and old dirt roads out on that mountain. Hiking, hunting, and just exploring the woods were among the most popular of our hobbies. In 1976, when I was 12, I had an old mini bike. This took me even further into the woods. There was this one old dirt track we discovered that begins my story. It was an old road, the 2 parallel ruts forming. It could have only been formed by wagon wheels and maybe deepened by the old Model T or its contemporary rivals. I rode down this old road alone one afternoon, and as I exited the other end back into an inhabited area, an old lady called to me from her front porch. I knew this old lady's name, but I will use no real names here to protect their anonymity. This lady asked me, "Did you come all the way through that holler of the hollow?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied. And she said, "Boy, you don't ever go through there. There's a reason why they block that road now." She had me curious. I asked why, and she says, "Sit down, boy. I'm going to tell you a story. Whether you believe it or not ain't my business, but if you ask around, other people can tell you." And this is the first time that I had ever heard about Whistling Jack. I always thought the name sounded silly, but you have to understand these were the same kind of people that called a species of quail a bobwhite because of its unique call, or called a yellow perch a sunfish because of its bright yellow belly. It all makes a kind of sense when you learn about these things. The old lady I was talking to had lived in that community all her life. Her family had lived there for generations, since shortly after Boone and Crockett had settled Tennessee. Her story that she told me took place in the early 1900s, before World War I. In those days, people here rode horses and carried guns. It was still a wild area. This was long before the TVA. Tennessee Valley Authority had brought electricity to these hills. There were 2 families. For the sake of the story, we will call them the Smiths and the Browns. The Smith family and the Brown family had small farms on opposite sides of the hollow on Saturday. A couple of times a month, the boys of the two families would get together at one farm or the other and play cards, drink some moonshine homemade wine, and generally have some fun. One fateful Saturday, the socializing went on well past midnight. This was not something that ever happened, as they were normally the type to go to bed early and rise at dawn well. It was around 1 a.m. when the Brown boys climbed on their horses and started down into the hollow on their way home. The trail they followed to the bottom of the hollow crossed the small creek at the bottom of a sandbar overlooked by a large boulder. As they started to cross the creek this particular night, they heard a bird call from the top of the boulder. The innocent sound for some reason panicked the horses all, but one of them bolted across the creek and up the trail as fast as they could gallop. The youngest brother was thrown from his horse as it reared in panic. The one thing that may have saved his life was the fact that his lantern fell in the sand and it did not break or go out. Further up the trail, as his brothers got their mounts under control, they then heard 6 rapid shots from a .45. They forced their horses to go back down to the creek. When they arrived at the grisly scene before them, they saw their kid brother on his knees in the sand by the lantern, trying to load his gun. Dropping some of the bullets from his shaking hands a few feet from him was his dead horse bleeding from its throat. "I shot it," he said. "You know, I never missed this close." It took them a while to get the story out of him, but he said that when he had been thrown from his horse, he looked up in time to see 2 large red eyes on top of the boulder. It whistled again as it then jumped for his horse. It all happened so fast he barely had time to unload his revolver into it in a quick succession of shots before it was on his horse, taking it to the ground. It was big. It ran stooped over on 2 legs. It was dark, shaggy, and stank. The quick shots of the pistol were not enough to save the horse, but he knew he had hit it as it gave a hissing growl and ran off into the woods. They had heard enough. Scared and now wary, they loaded him onto one of the boys' horses and rode home as fast as they could. The next morning, just after dawn, all the boys and their father took their guns and went back down the trail to the creek with the intention of hunting this thing down and recovering the youngest son's saddle and gear off the horse. They were all experienced hunters and trackers. Despite this, when they got to the creek crossing, the horse was gone. All the gear, saddle, bridle, rifle pouch were gone, as well the sand had been brushed clean like it had been swept with a pine branch. Even the blood was partially covered. No tracks could be found, and no trace of the horse or its gear except the blood mixed in the sand. Something about the way she gripped my arm when she said this, the look on her face, made me believe her. I told her I would not go back down there. I meant it. I rode the long way around the highway to get home, and little did I know at the time that my story had not quite ended. Whiskey, wait, that a Bob White, they not supposed to be calling this late at night. What in the all right, it's time to get out of here. 13 years later, I was 25. After 4 years in the military and a brief failed marriage, I was back on the mountain for a while. Depression soon had me roaming the woods again. When I wasn't working, the woods brought me peace. And there was one spot in particular, just a couple of 100 yards from the top of a line of sandstone cliffs along the bluff on the western side of the mountain. There was an old growth pine grove. I don't know if you've ever been in an old growth pine grove in the forest. The massive pine trees just seem to radiate a peaceful, quiet feeling. The thick canopy they provide inhibits undergrowth, so instead of crunchy dead leaves, you will have a carpet of fallen pine needles that cushion and silence your steps. It is common to find lush beds of moss in these places too. This place was several miles from that hollow I told you about before, on the other side of the plateau. Foolishly, I had spent the afternoon, evening, and well into the night hiking along the bottom of the cliffs. I had a small backpack, a little food, a couple of drinks among other things, and a couple of flashlights in case I found a cave I wanted to look into. I also carried my old Winchester Model 97 12 gauge, good solid shotgun. I should have known better than to be out there after dark sometime around midnight. I was sitting watching the valley lights when I heard a Bob White call below me. It sounded normal for a second, then I froze. Quail are not nocturnal. Then another call answered from the north, then another closer. I realized something was tracking me. I started moving toward the cliffs, climbing carefully. The calls kept following me, getting closer. I knew I was being hunted. I used a narrow rock crevice to climb up a hidden ledge and made my way to the top of the cliff. I could hear something below me moving through the brush, heavy steps circling. I reached the pine grove at the top and stopped. I heard them moving around the edge of the trees. I raised my shotgun and waited. They circled like they were searching for an entry point. Then I fired into the brush. A scream followed, not human, but deep and angry, then silence. I waited until daylight and left as soon as I could see. I have never hunted in those woods again.